I think it's an interesting time because it's never been easier than today to build a really great demo. And at the same time, it's probably never been harder to get something that you trust in production on a real critical process for a business.
Welcome to the Agentic Edge, where we explore the future of AI agents, enterprise orchestration, and the architectures that are shaping tomorrow's intelligent enterprises. My name is Micah Smith. I'm the host of this series. And in every episode, we pull back the curtains on the technologies, the decisions, the designs, the architectures, and the stories that are redefining what's possible for the enterprise of tomorrow. Today, we're talking about a piece of the platform that has quietly, or maybe not so quietly, become the foundational intelligence layer that's powering the agentic process automation experience in Automation Anywhere's platform. And that is the process reasoning engine, or PRE. And we're going to talk about how that's powering agentic process automation capabilities across Automation Anywhere's platform. Think of it as the intelligence layer that enables automations and AI agents to work together in concert. But I don't want to get ahead of myself because I'm going to let someone else define some of these things. That's just how I would explain it. But thankfully, I'm joined by someone who can break all of this down for us and help us understand it better. And that is Peter White, Automation Anywhere's Chief Product Officer. He's been at the center of defining agentic process automation here at Automation Anywhere, as well as PRE's design, rollout, and architecture. And today, he is here to share how PRE and agentic process automation are orchestrating agents, accelerating development, and making automations more resilient than ever before. Peter, welcome to Agentic Edge.
Thanks, Micah. Great to be here.
So, Peter, I'm going to start with a little bit of your background. For those that don't know, you've been working on AI and emerging products for quite a while now. This is not your first rodeo. So give us a little taste of your background.
Yeah. So I've been at Automation Anywhere for about 3 years now, leading our AI products portfolio. I joined Automation Anywhere the month before ChatGPT came out. So like to say I planned that, but it was great timing in terms of really pouring kind of rocket fuel onto everything that we can do with AI and ushering in and leading the market in terms of AI agents now. And then prior to that, I spent about 9 years at Salesforce. And the majority of my time there at Salesforce, I was building AI for our Service Cloud business. So everything to power customer conversations, service operations, agent assistance using AI before we had the exciting new LLMs that we use for everything, but still having a lot of impact for customers.
That was a much tougher experience at that time to think about training and all of the data you need and things like that.
Yeah, there was certainly a different set of challenges. And I think there's a new set of challenges to really be successful with LLMs and generative AI, but it was a different set of challenges back then for sure.
Peter, I want to start with maybe the toughest question I'll ask all day, which is how do you define agents? Because I see a lot of definitions of agents in the marketplace and across LinkedIn and Twitter. So how do you define agents?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think you'd probably get 10 different answers if you ask 10 different people. And my answer, to be fair, I think evolves over time too, as there's new technologies and new approaches to it. But the way I would describe it kind of most simply is that agents have some level of autonomy in taking action and using generative AI at their core. And so there's obviously, if I think about a spectrum for us in the way we use agents, we have at the very highest levels of autonomy, we have our goal-based AI agents that can really take any path, use a broad set of tools or capabilities to achieve a particular goal. And so that's a very high level of autonomy those agents have in getting to that goal. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have an agent that is using an LLM to help make a more discrete decision where there might be several different discrete outcomes that they can choose from. And there might be some inputs that are a little ambiguous, and the agent is essentially deciding which of those directions to go. And so that's less autonomy. There's a little bit more predictability in terms of which outcomes you're going to go after. But I think there's still a level of agency there in terms of you're using generative AI, you're using this LLM to actually make a decision and then take action. So there is a kind of an action piece of it as well.
Yeah, I like that, because in both of your definition examples you gave there, there's an action component. And I think we see a lot of agents in the marketplace that are purely just chat or conversational that may not actually have any action to them. It's more of a personal productivity, help me write this email better, kind of knowledge work more than it is action oriented.
Yep. How do you agents, Micah?
Yeah, put me on the hot spot. Yeah, I think when I think about agents, it's multi-step reasoning chain where, again, there's some action where the agent has the ability to take action. There's some kind of autonomy and there's some kind of problem solving and action as the outcome. But I 100% agree with you. I think it has to result in action. It has to be something, whether it's connected to an API or whether it's some kind of automation that gets invoked or some kind of MCP tooling that is used. I think it has to be tied to action for it to really be an agent, at least in my own definition.
Yep.
With that underlying definition of what we say are agents, how do you define agentic process automation? Because this is kind of a term that I first heard of coming from Automation Anywhere. So how do you define agentic process automation?
Yeah, so I look at this from two sides. One is, what are you trying to do with agentic process automation? And that is really to take a business process, I guess it could be a non-business process, but essentially a business process are the most common types. And you're using a combination of technologies, agents being a critical one, but also things like automation, things like document processing, things like human in the loop interaction to solve that business process, to automate that business process. And I think it's this combination of technologies typically that you're using, and it's the application of those technologies, again, to maybe it's processing and paying an invoice, or maybe it's supporting a customer ticket where you have an issue that is complex and needs to be solved, but there's a multi-step kind of process to troubleshoot and resolve that and follow up with the customer. You have agentic process orchestration working across that, solving it end to end, and using these different technologies in the process to get that done.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. So it's almost like a leveling up of one or more agents plus these other capabilities orchestrated together.
Exactly. Yep.
With the emergence of large language models, Automation Anywhere could have obviously said, hey, look, here's a connector that connects to OpenAI or to Anthropic's models. We're done. We're agentic. That was not the solution, or that was not what happened. How would you say, or how would you describe the customer pain points or product gaps that you recognize that led to the creation of agentic process automation and where we are today?
Yeah, I think there is value even just initially for customers who were able to connect to LLMs in the early days and bring those into their processes. They opened up some discrete functions that they could address, which were difficult before, partially because building specialized machine learning models in the past was a highly expensive and time-consuming task that they couldn't necessarily tackle. So I don't want to discount those, early days, let's call them. I think there's still value in some of those task specific ones. But I think what we see now with the latest generation of models and the way the technology is evolving is that they can go a lot further beyond those simple tasks. And they can do things that, for a business, unlock specific situations that typically were highly manual or even not done or poorly done in the past. Things where you have to arbitrate between a lot of different data, you have to kind of collect data, analyze data, take actions, get feedback. Those are things that in the past you wouldn't even attempt to automate those processes or those parts of a process. And now with AI agents and with the potential of these technologies, you can actually tackle those. And then when you combine that with the other parts of agentic process automation, other automation steps that might be required, or other interactions with people like approvals you might need in a process, you're now starting to look at some of the most complex and business critical processes a company has, and you can actually automate it end to end. and you can transform something as critical as your core customer operations, or as the way that you onboard suppliers and find in procurement or things like that, where you have kind of critical processes to a business that now can be automated end to end with this agentic process automation capability.
I like that. Yeah, I think you hit on something really important there, which is the fact that the automations can get better, but they can also be orchestrated better and used in a different way that makes them even more effective in solving problems. So, classifying emails and extracting key value data out of it. Would you have previously built a machine learning model to do that? Maybe for the classification, probably
Mhm.
not for extraction of data, at least not doing it easily. But now that's the kind of thing that you can enhance an automation with, but then also make that automation available as part of an end-to-end agentic workflow.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, actually, it's interesting you use that example because I've built machine learning models like that in the past for classifying emails, in some cases extracting data. But there's sort of a, okay, now we have all this data we extracted in the past, and now we're going to maybe make some specific decisions. Maybe we can route it somewhere or flag it as something in our database. But then there's a lot of manual work to follow up on that afterwards. Now, with agentic process automation, we actually have customers live who are processing incoming invoice documents. They're extracting the data from the emails, and then an agent is actually comparing that information, which can be highly variable because they can write anything in the email, against the attached invoice document to look for corrections between the invoice that was received and in a document and what was written in the email. Sometimes there's a clarification in the email that needs to edit the invoice data. You couldn't, I mean, you could, but it would be nearly impossible in the past to write an automation and use a machine learning model to do that sort of very dynamic comparison of data between a document and what's in an email and make decisions about edits and what should be actually finalized. But now an AI agent has the capability to do that. It can extract the data from the document. It can understand the email, extract data from there, do comparisons, make decisions, even look at systems of records to validate data or ensure that you have the correct information for that, and then continue on to process it. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of pieces that existed in the past, but now you're bringing this all together and you have this AI agent, which actually has intelligence to do dynamic things like that.
Yeah, and the time to value is night and day too, right? I mean, think about having to train all of those different models to do that versus now just write some really good prompts and you're probably mostly there.
Yeah.
Talk to me about some of the underlying technologies that power this from an automation anywhere perspective, right? Is this just a different way of calling an LLM and putting a wrapper on it and calling it agentic, or how does this actually work?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that I would highlight there. One is our process reasoning engine, which I'll talk about a little more. I know we want to get into that. It's an interesting area of our product. Um, and then the second piece of it, I think, is our critical to this is our orchestration capability. So the ability to orchestrate across all of these different technologies, across different systems, across different people. And that's really what kind of the backbone ties a lot of these agentic processes together. And then process reasoning engine, or pre as we sometimes call it, is this intelligence layer that allows us to execute agents and processes effectively using all of the context from our own insights around how processes in business run, also from customer specific context, what automations, what systems have they interacted with in the past and how do they interact with those, and then the ability for this core capability to learn. So to learn from every execution and get better. So what that means is, the agent I just described to you, this agent that's looking at these emails and looking at these invoices and trying to correct any data between the two based on the instructions coming in, that can be powered by our process reasoning engine, so it knows how that business makes decisions. How does that business determine what's correct between these two sources of data? What does it need to validate against their systems? And how does it get better over time? Because sometimes it might make a mistake, a person might correct it. Now, how does it use that as a learning to get better? And I think a lot of that's a kind of the secret sauce behind a lot of what we do at Automation Anywhere. It's been a core part of our product to drive these processes for businesses for a long time. And now we're using that expertise to drive these agents to run these processes more effectively and to solve these business challenges more effectively.
Got it. So you're saying that APA is essentially this blending of these deterministic processes along with goal-oriented agents. How does that orchestration really work under the hood? How does it know what to call, when to call, what's next?
So the way that agents on our platform know how to execute these processes is through, again, a combination of a definition that you provide the agent in terms of here's what your goal is, here's your action plan, here are the tools or automations or other AI agents or skills or document steps that you have access to complete this goal. And then again, we're using our process reasoning engine under the hood to help drive that effectively so it can actually complete that goal effectively for your business. And so it's orchestrating these different tools, it's iterating over multiple turns to figure out how does it get to that goal. And it might hit a roadblock along the way. And if it does, it can escalate to a person. We have our embedded co-pilot where you can escalate a situation to a person to clarify it or to make a decision that it might not be able to make independently. And so that's kind of what's happening under the hood when an agent is running. It's using our process reasoning engine, it's using an AI model to orchestrate this process to get to that goal. And one of the things that's important for many customers is obviously these are non-deterministic adaptive systems. How do I ensure it's going to work properly? How do I ensure it's not going to go off the rails? And so we provide ways for you to run evaluations of your agents. You can test them against your scenarios, real world scenarios that you have in your business, and measure how well they're performing and find out where they're failing. If they're failing, what do you need to do to go and correct that and improve it so it performs more effectively? And then once you're ready, once you've said, okay, this is 100% of the time or 95% of the time, this is getting the right answer. The other 5% of the time, it's actually escalating as it should to a person to make that decision. I'm ready to push this into production. I'm going to start running this on my real world processes. Now you need to monitor it. Again, it's going to hit new scenarios. It's may make mistakes in some cases. You want to make sure those get caught. And so we have a whole monitoring suite around that. So you can see what they're doing down to the exact level of prompts that are going in and out of the model. And you can keep an eye on that and make sure it's performing as you expect and take action if you need to change anything along the way.
It makes me curious to think about how the architecture of some of these agents will evolve and change over time, right? Because if I think about it, my evaluation can tell me, was it making the correct decision and how efficient was it at getting to that ultimate decision? But then there's also the other side of it where I can then modify what is the action plan or the definition for that agent, but then also what tools it has available to it, right?
Mhm.
And so I have a couple different variables that I can switch around here where I could essentially add more tools to the agent to give it more capabilities and or change the action plan so that it has a different definition or a different goal that I'm trying to orient it to or new data that maybe it didn't have before. How do you think about those? And I know you may not have a definitive answer that you'll look back 6 months from now and say that was exactly correct, but I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, I think those are both things that you're going to want to do over time. I think all of these agents are maybe this is a little bit different than the way customers are used to building processes and automations in the past, but these are sort of living things in the sense that you're giving them some of your hardest challenges, but as a result, they're going to need constant kind of care and improvement. So even once you're quote done with an agent, you're probably going to constantly have new scenarios come up where you go back and maybe you need to add a tool because you find that, wow, it can make a much better decision if it had access to this context. So I'm going to connect it to this system where it can get more data that will help it make the right decision and get the right outcome. And so I think those are going to be constant steps of improvement that you provide there. And I think the other thing that's interesting is over time, and this is one of the things we're working on, is how do we sort of let those agents self-improve, or at least guide the user of how they could improve? So suggesting something to the user like, based on the last 1,000 executions of this agent, here are the 5 things that could be improved, or why it's failing, and what you should do to go and improve it. And maybe someday it'll even do that automatically, so it'll be fully kind of self-improving. But I think there's a lot of interesting things that we will be able to do in the next few years in terms of making these agents more robust and getting them to get better and better at these tasks.
Yeah, that's wild. I love that idea, and I love the concept of that. I think it'd be really interesting, especially to watch where an agent's able to develop its own tools. Like, hey, here's a Python environment. Here are the available libraries you can use. Have at it if there's a tool that you need to build that you don't have right now,
Yeah.
just to see what would happen. I think that would be really crazy.
Yeah.
But keeping things not so crazy, something that's really important to a lot of customers I know is guardrails and governance. How do we make sure that the agents are making the right decisions? How do we make sure that things like PII are not being used in prompts that are leaving our environment? How do you think about those, and how are customers taking on that challenge?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting time because it's never been easier than today to build a really great demo. And at the same time, it's probably never been harder to get something that you trust in production on a real critical process for a business. So the gap there is what you just described. It's all of the kind of observability, the governance, the guardrails, which I'd say is sort of a new thing as you have these systems which are adaptive, protection of sensitive data, privacy, data security. All of these things are in a lot of ways harder than they were in the past, and more critical to a business that wants to use these technologies. And that's been one of the reasons why there's a lot of companies out there that have cool agent demos and cool agent builders. And you can do, again, great demo really fast, super exciting, but there's going to be a dead end at some point if you're in any sort of serious context of a business, because you won't be able to meet the requirements for a lot of these things. And we've really invested in that in terms of getting things like governance from the beginning, where you have full auditability of everything the agent's doing. You can flag content or situations where there may be issues. We have guardrails, sensitive data masking, so making sure any sensitive data that might go to the model that shouldn't gets masked out and isn't exposed. We have full role-based access controls around everything. You can manage all your model connections at a pretty granular level. And then, like I mentioned earlier, once these agents are running, you have observability to everything that's happening in real time, so that if there's issues, you can flag that and take action. And then evals is an important piece, like we mentioned earlier, in terms of testing these agents, both pre-production and then in production, running evals to keep track of how they're performing. So I think all of those things together are, we give a pretty comprehensive suite, and we're continuing to evolve it. I'm not saying we're done, but there's lots of new things coming every release, but it's a pretty comprehensive suite of things that we're focused on so that customers can get these into real use cases and not just in demos.
We've talked about the autonomous agents, or the goal-oriented agents some, and I think that's super interesting, and I'm super excited for what customers will build and what problems they'll be able to solve with that. We talked about the fact that that was ultimately powered by Pre. Talk to me about some of the other areas where the process reasoning engine shows up within the platform and what it's providing for users of Automation Anywhere.
Yeah. So the process reasoning engine, I think, was kind of born out of a concept of, how do we make these models and these technologies work effectively for business applications and business processes, which is frankly not what 90% of the world thinks about or uses these models for. A lot of it's kind of conversational use cases, interactions, looking up information, but they're not thinking about, oh, how do I stitch together these 3 different enterprise systems and get this data out of, this complex database format that I can use. And so with that motivation, there's lots of places that this is applicable in the context of a business. Like you said, goal-oriented AI agents is one, but also when you're building a process, and it might be building a automation or a process that's deterministic. It's not a goal-oriented AI agent. We can still use this process reasoning engine to understand the context of everything you've built in the past, the way you interact with your systems, and take your descriptions and turn those into contextually aware pre-built automations. So as a developer, as an automation leader, you can quickly take an idea to automation using process reasoning engine as this intelligence to translate what you want to do into the actual specifics of how it might work. And then you're going to tweak it and finish it and get it ready. But that's another application of process reasoning engine. Another good one is that's for the builders. And then there's the people who are using these automations. These are the customer service agents, they're the finance analysts, they're the claims analysts. All these folks who are using these automations can also interact with pre, and they can describe what they want to do. And again, process reasoning engine can translate that into, here are the automation steps, here's the automation that's available to you to complete that particular need. And so matching intent of a user in a business context to, oh, here's your claims exception approval process that I can execute for you. Do you want me to go ahead and do that? Yes. And so that's another great application of process reasoning engine, which again requires understanding the business and understanding the context of a particular customer so that you can do that effectively.
Got it. So, but to be clear, when I'm using these capabilities, I'm not necessarily saying I want to use pre here. It's a built-in capability of the platform, if I understand correctly?
Yeah, that's right. This is a technology layer that we built into the platform. It's something that's sort of behind the scenes when you're doing these tasks as a developer, as a business user, when you're running an AI agent. Process reasoning engine is behind the scenes executing that for you and helping make decisions for you in that process. But you don't have to explicitly, say, I want to use pre. You're trying to get your job done basically on our platform. Pre is behind the scenes helping you do that.
One of the other areas where I understand pre comes into play is around document processing. And this is an area that I think is just exploded over the last year and a half or so because of the ability to process these unstructured document types, which previously were pretty much off limits because traditional methods of extraction made them very difficult to work with, right? If I'm looking for that key value pair, or like I'm looking for a label and then a piece of text, that doesn't really work well in a contract or some other document where it's free form. I don't know how the text is going to be laid out. Talk to me some about Automation Anywhere's approach to IDP, or intelligent document processing.
Yeah, we've seen a huge explosion in the usage of our document automation product, which is our IDP product, since we introduced generative AI for extraction in 2023. We were really the first kind of vendor to recognize that this was the future of how data extraction would work inside of these products. And it's just been incredible to see that now I think it's close to 80% of all of the documents that go through our system use generative AI by pages. So you can see that this is quickly kind of eaten every other technology that was used in the past for document extraction. And it's no surprise. It definitely, it's highly effective at getting data out of even your messiest, most complex documents. You have handwritten documents, you have long form documents, you have hard to read, poorly formatted things. A lot of the techniques we use with these new models, including multimodal models using vision, can extract accurate data from those. And it's also a lot easier for people to set up because, you were in the past doing this thing where you would have to train these ML models with a bunch of samples and label data. And Now, in many cases, it's as simple as writing an English or whatever language descriptive prompt of what you want. You might tweak it a little bit based on some testing, but that might be all you need to get the data you want out of a document with our system, where we have a lot happening in the background once you write that prompt. So it's really transformed it. And the fact that we were the first kind of vendor to get this out there, and we've seen such high volume of usage, we've actually learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work when it comes to using these models for extracting data, and how you can build systems around them that get data even more accurately extracted from them. And so that's been the evolution where, again, we've kind of, this is another part of but we've use that learning to build a system which does a lot more than just what a raw LLM and a prompt will do if you want to extract data from a document. It actually has a lot of pre-processing steps. We're giving cues from previous user feedback into the model. We're validating what's extracted from the document to ensure it's correct. We're iterating if necessary. And we're getting high quality, accurate outputs from these documents using, at their core, generative AI, LLM models for extraction, but with a lot of capabilities on top of that.
Yeah, that's great. I saw someone did a demo recently where they were actually using the vision models to extract text from a language that isn't supported by any of the common OCR providers, which is wild that they were able to accurately extract that data just using these vision models, even though it wasn't fed the OCR text and just said, hey, find this thing. It was purely vision models to extract that text in an unsupported language, which was absolutely wild. You talked about something I think that was really interesting, and something that I've heard as an objection before. People say, well, what if I just, take all the text from the document and then I send that to the LLM and then I prompt it for the stuff that I want? How is that different from what Automation Anywhere is doing?
So there's a lot that happens prior to actually using a generative AI model for extraction in our document automation system. So even upstream of anything text or document related, we do things like classification of the document. We can split out documents. We can improve the images in the documents. When we do get text, we're actually not just naively taking all that text out and dumping it into a model. We're understanding the layout. We're detecting things like if there's tables in there, if there's sections in there, if there's figures in there. How do we get that context in a format that LLM can understand and have the relevant context from the rest of the document in there as well? We're then considering things like cues that are based on prior feedback. So when there was a correction to a data extraction in the past, how does that feed into the model so it gets it right this time? So we're actually giving it those sort of hints along the way. And then when it finally goes to the model, even though the user is giving a really simple one sentence prompt, maybe with some clarifications in it, we're actually optimizing that in terms of, here's all the context of what you need. Here's additional data that we have. Here's kind of optimized inputs for this document type. All of that is getting fed into the model. And then we're getting the output and we're validating all of that. But there's a lot of steps that go into that. And it's pretty easy. I mean, we gladly, take any document you have, we'll compare it against, you put it in ChatGPT and ask it to do this, and then we'll do the same thing in ours. And it's night and day in terms of the accuracy that you can get. Beyond any sort of super simple scenario, you're just not going to get the accuracy across hundreds, thousands, millions of documents using a simple, let's just prompt the LLM to do this for us approach.
I like that. So there's a significant amount of enrichment that happens beyond just making a request or making that prompt and then getting the result back. Peter, I want to understand how you see both agentic process automation and the process reasoning engine kind of evolving over the next, I'm going to say 12 months, because I think 18 months is completely unfair for anyone to predict the future.
Yeah.
12 is fair, though.
Yeah, I think 12 is fair. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of new things we're working on with respect to process reasoning engine and agentic process automation. So I just have to pick the top ones for you here. I'm excited about what's going to be possible in terms of the complexity of processes that we can solve and really optimizing the accuracy, if you will, of the ability to solve those problems. So I think today, there's a lot of it's still early days in terms of the goal-oriented agents where you really are letting these agents have high degrees of autonomy, giving them access to tools, especially as that number of tools grows, and expecting them to perform reliably against executing that goal. I think that in and of itself is an area we think with our process reasoning engine, we're ahead, but we still think there's a lot of room to grow and optimize for that, especially as you want to do more complex processes. Because you can imagine if today, in a really complex, let's say a loan approval process, you might have 90% of that done deterministically. Like, I need to do this for the loan approval. I need to do this next. There's defined steps. And then there's maybe 10% of it that you give to an AI agent that is a little bit more ambiguous around understanding risk profiles or making determinations about data consistency or things like that. That could shift. So now it's 90% deterministic, 10% adaptive AI agents. That could start to be 20% AI agents, 30% AI agents, 40% AI agents. So I think you'll see these agents, as they can handle more complex tasks, eat away at some of the deterministic logic, which makes them more robust and also in some ways simpler to build because there's less corner case logic they have to program for, and they can delegate that to these agents to handle those situations. So that's one. I think the other thing is we're starting to see some good use cases for maybe at least starting at the lower end, some simpler on-demand agent tasks getting done. So really, you have some predefined, it's not going to be your entire loan approval process created on the fly from a user prompt. It's simply too complex and too high risk, but there are other tasks that might work across a few different systems where a user could simply prompt and we could build in real time a agent, a process to get that done and execute it for them. So I think that's another kind of interesting direction we're headed. And that will require a convergence of some of the experience layer around conversational experience that we have in our Copilot now, as well as obviously our AI agents. And then we're also introducing some things around context intelligence, so you have access to all of the data necessary to do those things correctly. So there's kind of a convergence of technologies we're seeing there that will enable that.
I love that. Peter, last question, second to last question. I know you're a voracious reader. You're also watching a lot of videos and the space of AI and emerging technologies. What technologies do you see having the biggest impact on agentic process automation in the future?
Yeah, I think for agents in general and for agentic process automation, one of the areas I'm really interested in and excited about is this area of evals and then hence kind of reinforcement learning based on that. I think today a lot of evals are used to benchmark performance in many cases, but they can also be used to self-improve these systems in terms of here's the output you need to achieve, you can explore and find the best path to get there. And I think that's pretty exciting. It's something we can do today and we're starting to do, but it's something that can be optimized further. And you can imagine taking it all the way to a concept of a simulated enterprise environment. And you have these tasks you need to achieve and let the systems explore dynamically and figure out how to solve those and then use that as a reinforcement learning mechanism on the system. That's pretty exciting to me and one of the things I'm definitely thinking a lot about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that'll be really cool when you can start to run those simulations and be able to do that testing without specifically doing the testing manually, right? With the evaluations. So you can make good determinations about not only your agent, but the underlying model you're using and the tooling that you're giving to it. Speaking of tooling, I've seen a lot of MCP, I will say aggregators, where they're putting together these lists. MCP Hub is an example of that, where there's thousands of MCP servers that are listed there. How do you think about agents, having access to a bunch of these MCP servers and what that could open up for some of these agentic solutions?
Yeah, I think that's a near-term thing even that companies will want to start to use is the ability to connect to different platforms, different tools using MCP as a standard. I think that's gonna, if that ecosystem continues to evolve, it would really become kind of a foundational part of every agent workflow is how does it reach out to different tools, different agents through MCP. I don't know, in terms of opening up the whole slew of them to an agent. I think that maybe some not so good things would happen. So you might have to be a little measured in terms of which MCP connectivity options you give your agents. But I do think there's going to be a lot of new things there. And I think it's pretty exciting as an industry to see that there's all these kind of things being quickly developed so we can learn, we can improve, and we can build these new agentic systems and workflows.
Yeah, I think there's probably a huge difference between a MCP server that was built by a huge SaaS company versus one that's like some guy just sitting in a room and publishing it, because you don't really know what's on the other side of it necessarily. So that could introduce some interesting things.
Yeah. Yeah. And you might want to be careful, how many of those MCP tools you give to your agent in case they do start to come up with some creative uses for the various functions available in, in
Absolutely.
in those.
So if someone's curious about agentic process automation, they're curious about the process reasoning engine, what's your call to action? What's something that you would say, hey, get started with this, go read this, go take a look at this? What's the thing for you?
Yeah, Micah, there's lots of great content that folks can take a look at and then also start to get their hands on with agentic process automation. Definitely check out our website. There's some good blog posts around how agentic processes are kind of eating more of the software stack. And there's also our APA masterclass, which is a great hands-on way to really get a feel for these and learn how to build them. And then also, when you're ready, our community edition will soon have the ability to build these agents. You can try them out for free. You can get some cycles on them and really, again, build an intuition for them and start to learn more about it. I think those are all great ways to do it. I definitely prefer to learn by doing rather than just kind of reading about the philosophy of it. So anything you can do to actually start trying it is great.
Yeah, you just torpedoed your blog post and there goes all your clicks. I will have a link to all of those assets in the show notes and in the video as well, so people can check that out. Peter, thank you so much for joining. This has been a great conversation. Sincerely appreciate your time. And I'm really excited about the vision forward for agentic process automation and the capabilities of the process reasoning engine.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, Micah. It's been great.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Agentic Edge podcast. If you found this episode valuable, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. It helps more people to find the show and stay on the edge of what's next in enterprise AI and automation. That's all for me, and we'll see you next time on Agentic Edge.